Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be able to be here. What a great conference this has been. This has been an experience and an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to share, and I'm excited to be here with you today. I want to begin by telling you a story. I am a storyteller by trade, if you will. I love to be able to talk to people and to be able to share information. A few months ago, I was in the office, and we work as a large team in our Hunt and Incident Response team in the United States. It's a fairly large team, and we're a very high energy, high productivity, high stress environment. We are doing things constantly that most people ramp up to. And so the normal exciting things that get cyber defense teams to be very spun up is kind of daily routine for us. And so for my guys, when they're gathered together to get excited is unusual. And a few months ago, a couple guys, I'm sitting at my desk, and I noticed a few guys gathering over in a corner, and they're getting very excited. And this catches my eye. And then more people start getting really excited. And I finally stand up and I go over and I talk to them. And I say, what's going on? What are you finding? And they said, we have just found APT activity where they're using link files, shortcuts, for persistence without clicking on them. And they said, we haven't seen this before. How does this work? This is awesome. Well, in a few minutes, I'll tell you what they found. Second story to tell you today. A few weeks later after that, I'd gone into the office early, was working through, had to stay late because of the number of meetings, and it was fairly late at night. And I walked back through the floor where all of our analysts sit, and everyone had gone home except for one. He happens to be one of my favorite analysts. Don't tell him, I'm not allowed to have favorites. But he was one of my favorite analysts. And he's sitting there, and he's working at his terminal, and he has Photoshop up. Now, how many of you use Photoshop in your normal day-to-day operations for cyber defense, right? He has Photoshop up, and it looks like he's playing a very complex game of puzzle. You know, the one where you have to adjust all the squares to get everything to line up in the picture? And I looked at him and I said, what are you doing? It's like 10:30 at night. I'm like, go home, go be with your family. What are you doing? And he says, this is awesome. I'm reassembling graphical data flow out of captured network traffic or out of cached network traffic of actual RDP sessions from a threat actor. It was fantastic to be able to work through this. Our team got excited over this campaign. And I want to talk you through, today what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is walk you through what we as the United States government learned, and not just on this specific campaign, but as we apply this across the board to numerous different things in this element. So standard disclaimer applies, thank you government, okay? As we talk about the National Communications and Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, I'll be the US government, let's call it NCCIC. As I talk about the NCCIC, our mission is to look at the overall resiliency and capability of the entire critical infrastructure of the United States. We don't just look at a specific organization. We don't just look at the case that we are working. We look at the big picture. And in so doing, that puts some controls on us that we have to do, but it also gives us an advantage over being very narrowly focused. And so when we talk about our vision, we're really talking about the big picture in that effort. Now, how do we do that? We walk through and we do some very specific things. One, we've realized we have to get hands-on, incident management. We have to be able to deal with the data directly. We can't get everything we need from reading someone's report of a report of a report. So we get down and dirty with the data and work with the customers directly. We do a lot of in-depth analysis and have those capabilities. And information sharing is critical. It's not just all that we do. We talk with our federal partners within the United States. We talk with our international partners. We talk with victims. We talk with private cyber firms, et cetera. All of this coming place to gather the data together to build as big and comprehensive a picture as we possibly can. And all of this comes together in a very cohesive manner with a number of activities that we do at NCCIC. It's not just all about the Hunt and Incident Response team, although Mark and I like to think it is sometimes. Okay, it's not just about getting out there and doing these things. It's about bringing the whole picture together. So we look at different things such as our watch floor operations and our reach out to our federal partners, the ISAC program that's in the United States. All of this is about having hundreds of pieces of information a day flowing in pertaining to a specific topic. Okay, that sets the groundwork for what we're trying to do, because we're not trying to solve the case of why one specific company was intruded one time by a threat actor. We are trying to understand the big picture of why a sophisticated campaign was ongoing against an organization. So let's dig into the campaign. What am I talking about? The campaign itself is talking about APTs. The title slide said Russia, okay? Hundreds of victims, primarily focused in the energy sector. And when I say energy sector, I'm talking primarily about electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. There were some victims that were targeted or affected down in nuclear aviation, some in the US government, et cetera, critical manufacturing, but primarily focused on the energy sector. The response effort that went out was a cohesive effort. It went across the multiple domains, different agencies, different private organizations to be able to respond to this effort. And the bullet of the very bottom bullet you see on the slide is really a punchline of this presentation. The effect that the United States has seen to this date has been limited to access. We have not seen physical impact. We haven't seen them change the state of a physical process. Gotten to the point that we'll talk about how far they've gotten, but they haven't gotten to the point they actually did it, okay? So as we work through this, let me use this graphic to demonstrate and to talk through the timeline of how things happen. Now, bullseye on the screen, the center of the bullseye is where they want to get to. This is the crown jewels, if you will, dead center of the screen. And as you move out on the eccentric rings, you start to see the ancillary connections. And I'll build this picture for us. This begins in early 2016. There's a vendor out there. What do I mean by vendor? I mean those supporting companies. Let's talk about construction companies. Let's talk about R&D partners. Let's talk about third-party suppliers, elements like this, okay? They go out to one of these organizations and they compromise their network. Spearfishing, watering hole, et cetera. They get into their network, they own the network, and then they sit there. And you're gonna see this dot just kind of hang out over here on the right-hand side for a while. We'll come back to it in about 19 slides, okay? So it hangs out over here. This is early 2016. Threat actor goes out and compromises a second vendor, not related to the first. They do not know each other. They do not talk to each other. They do not have connectivity between them. They compromise a second vendor. This vendor, again, in that research construction kind of element. And then they leverage that network that they have compromised to be able to go out and start attacking others that they know. And here we see some phishing attacks go out, one against a vendor, another one against a US government organization. And these phishing attacks originate from this trusted vendor. Now, the two lines you see on the screen, here's the bullet that you need to, or the principle that you need to understand. This is a pre-existing relationship. This organization, both these organizations knew and were doing business with this vendor prior to the event, prior to the phishing attack occurring. Now, that doesn't sound so strange yet, but you're gonna hear me use that term many, many more times in the next few minutes. Pre-existing relationship exists, and then we see them move on to the next stage. They go on and they use vendor number 3 to go across. Here we see an intrusion go across to vendor number 4. They know each other, 3 and 4 know each other. Number 4 goes out, we see number 4 reach out to organizations, let me say it differently, the threat actor through vendor number 4, reach out to numerous organizations that they do business with, pre-existing relationships, and we start to see the cascading becoming effect. Now we're into utilities, now we're into energy companies, now we're into nuclear, et cetera. Seeing the pattern? Then we move through and we see it go back to vendor number 3. Vendor number 3 reaches out, and there's a couple unique things here. One, there's a new company identified down towards the center. It's a company outside the United States, but we also see a redacted energy company, right-hand side of the screen, that you see 2 lines going to the same bullet. And you start seeing that the threat actor is using 2 different trusted sources to attack the same victim. And let's keep the process going. Now we come back to that dot that we've been ignoring for a number of slides, and we start to see them utilize that original infrastructure that they built to reach out and be able to communicate with these targets and these victims in this effort. Again, and highlighting that point, 3 arrows pointing to the same bullet. And if you go back and think about it, one is you go, this is really unique, this is cool. But if you're the defender of that victim's network, and you see that the initial intrusion and the C2 communications and the bridge by which infections come in are all different and they're all unrelated, and you're trying to find this. You're not trying to post-mortem do the forensics, but you're trying to identify this initially up front. You realize the complexity here. And you also realize that when you look at this slide that, let me get one more screen on here, you see the same thing come back and they leverage vendor number 3s to come back and reach out to the infrastructure. We see here that this was not something which was a low-hanging fruit attack. This is not one where they compromised the network and said, where can we bounce from here? Very clearly it's understood that they knew what they were after and strategically moved in. And they set out their goals and worked towards that process. Well, this is less about what the APT does. This is more about how do we as network defenders appropriately position ourselves to respond to this style of attack. Both the one that's happening now, the tactical answer, but also strategically as we talk about the future. So who are these people? Who are we actually talking about? Let me begin with the bottom half of the slide, what we call staging targets, or the center of the bullseye. These are small, medium, and large businesses. Okay, some of these are very significant organizations in the United States, names that all of you would know. Some of them are very small names you couldn't hardly find on the internet. Okay, it ranges between. This does not mean that these are only the big targets they were after. But the commonality is that they generally all had fairly sophisticated cyber. They realized they had a threat. They had implemented good controls, for the most part, no one's perfect, but they'd implemented good controls. They were well defended. The upper part, the outer rings, these are those third parties. They're less well defended because they're smaller, because they don't see the threat quite as much. And they all have these pre-existing relationships that were out there in this effort. Now, I gave the examples before, vendors and integrators and strategic R&D partners and construction companies, elements like these companies by which they've been doing business for years. And so when it comes in, when you're the network defender looking at the logs and you're saying, what's unusual, to capitalize on our last presentation, what's the anomaly, you're going to see a connection from an IP address that you have seen connections from for the past 15 or 20 years. It's not going to stand out. And it's probably going to be a communication channel that you've seen before. So let me dig in and start talking a little bit more technical. What did they do and how did they do it? What I would like to present today is not the comprehensive story. I don't want to take you through the whole thing because all of you will miss your flights tomorrow if I tell you all the details. What I'm going to do instead is tell you what I consider to be the cool parts. They're the parts that get my team excited. They're the parts that are different, unusual, and honestly just fun to talk about. Now, read the whole story, get all of the indicators, all the TTPs, etc., at the technical alert that we published a few months ago on the screen. That's the TA 18074A alert. I want to focus on the unique ones and be able to walk through that. I'm going to start in the corporate environment because just like we've just learned from Joe, we often begin in the corporate world, and that is true here. So let's talk about what they did in the corporate side of the house to start with. And we begin in the kill chain by talking about reconnaissance. Reconnaissance, what did they find on the outside? A few elements here to talk about. One, we saw them access the corporate websites of the organizations that were being targeted, both the staging and the supporting targets. They go out and they access them, and they do it by human clicking, right? This is not scraping, pulling all the data back. You know, it's pretty obvious when you're looking at forensics when they scrape a website and then take it offline. No, this is clicking around by a human. The timing supports it, et cetera. We can see that they're looking through and they're strategically going to certain pages, elements that are targeted in specific areas. It's not a scripted effort. Other thing that I want to mention, let's talk about photographs for a minute. Let's talk about HR websites. Let's talk about press releases and elements like this. And I do this to highlight the risks that we see at the asset owner level. In a number of instances, they go out and they visit an HR website, or they visit the press release where there's this awesome article that's done with very, very innocent kind of approaches. There's a photograph. And anyone out there remember this coding language we call HTML? You heard of it before? Okay. All right, so HTML has this cool, awesome feature. The image tag, img src equals file name, and then you can put H and W after it, and it stands for height and width. Why do we have that? Because you can take a very big image and you can shrink it down. And in many, many different applications today, this happens automatically. But the basic idea is that we take a very large photograph and we cram it down and fit it into the press release so it looks right on the screen. What's really happening is the server hosts that high-resolution photo. So threat actor goes out and downloads a number of the high-resolution photos. And the interesting part about this TTP is they only download photographs that are of very public events and groundbreakings and handshake ceremonies with the mayor and things like this, but they only download the photographs that have control systems in the background. And on those photographs, you see things like set points, you see model numbers, maybe you see a password taped to a screen, to a monitor. You see these kind of elements, right? Okay? And you don't see it unless you do the infamous, what we've all become very good at, the pinch to zoom on the iPhone experience, right? You zoom in and then those things become very visible. But they go on and they download a number of these photographs. Reconnaissance. Have they done anything that is inherently bad that some automated filter is going to pick up on? Probably not. But they're out there gathering information. Credential harvesting. One of my favorite topics. When we talk about spearfishing, everybody knows spearfishing, everybody talks about it all day long. What is the main mechanism by which spearfishing collects information or does its damage? The number one thing we talk about is that they put some kind of malicious code into the document. So I'm going to send you, I'm a threat actor, I'm going to send you a PDF file, or I'm going to send you a Word document, something like this. I'm going to put a macro in or some zero-day exploit, and I'm going to implant something on your computer. Malicious code in the document. It's not what we saw here. The second most common thing you do with an attachment or spear phishing is you put a link in it. Please click here, and I'm going to ask you to give me something, or I'm going to take you to a website that then exploits your computer. We didn't see that here. To understand what they did with spear phishing, we have to go back and talk about one other topic kind of quickly, and that is Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word, has anyone ever out there gotten the error about normal.m? It's not cyber related, it's a functional error. What is normal.m? It's a template file. And occasionally Microsoft Word screws up and just throws this error up because it's missing or can't be found or whatever the case may be. It is the document that lives on your computer that tells Microsoft Word how to format the page, the blank page. And Microsoft also has the feature to be able to attach or reference to a different template file if you want to specify different characteristics about that document. And this is contained in the metadata of the file itself. So normally, in like 99.99% of the time, the normal.m lives in some temp file on your hard drive and everybody just uses the same thing. But occasionally it points somewhere else. And in this case, the threat actor sends an attachment that references a template file that is located at file:/IP address /normal.m, or something very similar to that. And this sets off a cascade of events. Because it's not an HTTP reference, it's going to go out a file:// reference, which is SMB. And I'm presuming all of us in the room understand the basics of SMB. It's awesome, we use it all the time, it's designed for internal networks, and we live and breathe by it. But it sets off the cascade of effects that, so suddenly I have an SMB outbound to an external IP address. Yes, there's a contingency here, we'll talk about that mitigation later. Sends out an outbound SMB request to a threat actor controlled C2 server. And that C2 server does exactly what Microsoft does with all Windows-based file share servers running SMB. It says, I've never heard of you before. Who are you? And the client says, I do this 100,000 times a day. Let me prove to you who I am. And it sends it the user's hash. Very normal behavior. And at this point, it does not matter if the compromised C2 server sends back the normal.m template. It does not matter, because the credential hash has already left and is now in the possession of the threat actor. Okay? This is not complex, but it's cool. Okay? Does that make sense? So the hash goes flying out the door. Now, yes, SMB has to be allowed outbound, but the hash goes flying out the door and it's gone. Okay? Now, that's spear phishing. Let's talk about watering hole, because it didn't always happen by spear phishing. Watering hole is a very similar attack. This time, because threat actor has compromised your specific vendors that you like to work with, they go compromise the vendor's website, and they add an iframe. And the iframe source is file:/IP address /index.html, or something similar to that. And guess what it does? It initiates an SMB session. Your credentials go running out the door. And your credentials have now walked out. And it's an SMB transmission because I'm pretty certain that none of you have alerting for internal SMB traffic alerts, or else your SOC is very busy. Okay? So you don't see this going out. Credentials leave the door. Now, they don't have an implant on the inside, but they do have creds. So what do they do with this? How do they move forward from there? Initial network access. They walk in the front door that we gave them. We as the defenders install these things called VPN gateways, or Outlook web access, or how about remote desktop? I can't tell you how many different companies we responded to that we said, do you have RWA or remote desktop forwarded on your main firewalls from your primary IPs or your primary IP space? You know the universal answer? No, of course we don't. 3389 wouldn't dare be publicly exposed. And then after about an hour of talking with them, we find out, yes, sure enough, it's forwarded right to that workstation from 2 years ago when it was really inconvenient and you needed, one of your engineers needed to be able to remote in, and you left it that way for the past 2 years. So we had instances where remote desktop is enabled and they put in the username and password and walk straight in because the port's forwarded. We had situations where VPNs were able to be logged into by single-factor authentication. And I'll tell you, on the more sophisticated targets, this usually wasn't vpn.company.com. This was usually side door set up for something very specific in a very narrow audience. You know, I have some situation where, only this vendor can only come in by single-factor authentication. So I'll set it up for their 5 users. But my 10,000 users, my corporate users, come in my main door. But they didn't actually go in and whitelist the user list. They just assumed the administrative control of not telling the user base about the second side door was sufficient. So the threat actor goes out and says, I found not a backdoor, but a side door that's single factor authenticated, and they walk straight in. OWA, they walk up to the website, they type in the username and password, and they're in. And it doesn't look all that unusual, because what IP address is this coming across as? That vendor that I've seen that same IP for a long time. Not strange or unusual in that regard. So now they're on the corporate network. I paused for this slide, and I'll tell you why I paused for this slide. I really don't like this slide. I wrote the slide deck, I don't like this slide. This slide has a bunch of tool names on it, right here in the corner, starting with Mimikatz. They're names that you recognize. And my problem with this slide is everybody looks at this slide and they say, oh, that's the tools they used. So if I go search my environment for these tools, I'll be sure to know if the threat actor has been there. No, that's not the way it works. These are the tools they used when they couldn't live off the land, when they couldn't find another quieter way to be able to get there, then they went over. So the absence of Mimikatz should not, in your mind, register that the threat actor wasn't there. Not at all. That assumption would be invalid. Okay, these are the tools that we saw occasionally, but not consistently. Link files. Remember how we talked about how they got the credentials out originally? Cool. These little things called shortcuts in Windows, LNK. They consist of two things. Don't think like a geek for a second, think like a user. They consist of a picture and a title. And we've seen attacks in the past where a threat actor will point a shortcut file to a malicious location or document or activity, and when the user double clicks, then it does something bad. Well, in this case, they did a very similar attack to what we saw before. Instead, that image file that's part of the shortcut file, that's in the metadata. You can reference that. Anybody ever right-clicked on a shortcut and said change image, change icon? And it gives you about 30 icons to choose from. And there's a box that says browse, and you can go pick your own graphic. What a novel concept. So they go into the link file, and they change the reference to, you guessed it, file:// IP address / image.jpg. And now what happens? When the user opens up the folder that has the shortcut in it, or more pertinently, when they open up their desktop, because the shortcut's saved to the desktop, just the instance of looking at the image initiates the data call, and the credentials go flying out. So a story for you, we go out and respond to an organization that's dealing with this campaign. They knew they had a problem. They knew they had lost credentials. So they did the playbook move. They reset all the passwords in their entire corporate network. Big effort. Anybody who's ever been through it, that's not simple for a corporation that's not focused on cyber. So they go through and they reset them all. And then they gave the all clear to all their employees. Hey, all passwords reset, go ahead, log back in. Everybody logs back in, up comes their desktops, displays those icons, and all the creds go right back out. Make sense? Okay? Persistence, not your typical persistence mechanism. This is not what we're normally presenting on at conferences like this. We're talking about very sophisticated implants and malware. No, this is a very simple way to make sure you keep getting the creds. Let's transition and talk about control systems. Everything I've said so far was in the corporate environment. The threat actor, as they're going out there, as they're doing the reconnaissance, is searching for specific keywords. They're trying to understand about the control systems of the particular victim. Because as we know, unlike IT, OT systems, there are no two identical OT systems. When you hire a new engineer in your corporation, for those of you who are asset owners, you realize that an engineer takes 3 to 6 months just to understand how to get around your own network, because everyone is its own unique flavor and configuration. Well, the threat actors have to do the same thing. So they need to understand what types of systems and what do they look like and how do you connect them and how have you configured them. So they're out there trying to understand at the open source level, what is it you're using? And then as they start to come in, they start to dig deeper. Other thing that we see is the phishing emails that go out are targeted towards the OT professionals, the engineers, et cetera. They're targeting the HR organizations with control system resumes, control system operators. By the way, if any of you ever get to see that resume, I want to hire that person. They're highly qualified, okay? All right, good resumes, convincing. And as Mark said in his keynote, the job of HR is to open unknown email attachments from unknown individuals. And it tends to be fairly effective. And so we see the targeting of the control system theme throughout this entire effort. Once they get in, once they're past the corporate or they're into the corporate, what do? They go into the file shares, they go into the email accounts, and they're searching for data. related to control systems. We're seeing wildcard searches for things that are very broad, like SCADA, but we also see things that are very specific. They're down there, they want the architecture layouts, they want the reference diagrams, they want the user manuals, they want the configuration files, and in numerous cases, they get them. And they take them and they exfil them. When we talk about what data is exfilled during this campaign, it's this type of data that we see flowing out. So they get this data. They're also gathering more credentials because now they need credentials to be able to get into the OT systems because in many cases they had properly segmented their networks. They needed a new set of credentials. So they're gathering those credentials. And then they begin to jump across. They begin to use those jump boxes, those things that we as security professionals have told them to put in place because we can monitor them and we have in some ways guaranteed to them that as long as you run through this jump box, you're gonna be okay. So guess what? They now have the credentials of the engineer that they've been targeting, whose daily job is to log into the jump box to get into the operations side of the house to be able to make changes. They have those creds and they have access to the inside. So what do? They look just like John Doe engineer. They log into the jump box. Let's pause there for just a second. Jump box is generally a graphical interface in this case. One of two things, either Windows Remote Desktop or the alternative. What's our big alternative to Remote Desktop? VNC. VNC has a really cool feature. VNC has the ability to save shortcuts. It's a really cool thing. The shortcut contains, it's basically a configuration file. It contains the IP address and the port number and the configuration strings and a bunch of other things that make it really easy for the operator to not have to enter that every time. So you save them to your desktop, you double click on the one you want and you're in. You have to put in your password and you're into the system. So the threat actor says, wow, this is interesting. I just remote desktoped into the jump box and there are 50 shortcuts on the desktop. Copy, paste, exfil. And they get all of the jump ports that you're trying to go to on the other side. They exfil that data. They now have all the configurations. They know exactly where to go to be able to get the data they need. They exfil that data out. Okay, now how do I actually get into the HMI? Very simple, threat actor, I double click on the shortcut, I enter my password, and I'm in. And I start seeing things like this. Now, this is the other half of the story that I need to tell you. I told you about my Photoshop analyst. It's got a new nickname. My Photoshop analyst recompiled this 8 pixels at a time. This is not a screenshot that we went up to the asset owner and said, please take the screenshot for us. This is not a screenshot where DHS went in and took it. This is a picture that we reassembled out of RDP cache that we captured going out to the threat actor. So we put bit by bit out of cache, pulled it together, played puzzle, built this image. We've redacted a few things, there's a few pieces that are missing. But you start seeing what they had access to. You start seeing options like generator and compressor and turbine. What happens when you right-click on turbine? Remember, the threat actor is logged in with operator credentials whose job is to make changes to the system. What happens when you right-click on turbine? You have options to do things like shut down, speed up, slow down. There's a button at the bottom called silence. What do you think that pertains to? An alarm system. Wouldn't it be nice if a threat actor could turn off the alarm? You start seeing where this HMI comes into play. Okay? Now, I want to caveat something. I don't want to imply, I don't want you to take away that all of the hundreds of victims I mentioned on slides 2 or 3 got to this stage. In fact, the number of intrusions that got to an HMI level is very small. The number that got into control systems is fairly small. But this is the direction they were headed. We have proof that the threat actor got to this point. They had the access using the operator level administrator rights at the HMI. But as far as I know today, they didn't push any buttons. Does that make sense? Okay, that's where we get to. So what should we be doing as defenders? Where should we be at? Several things. I'm really grateful to have followed the previous Dragos presentation because it highlights exactly what we were just talking about, indicators and TTPs, et cetera. First one is, if you haven't ever seen this before, if what I'm telling you is brand new, go search. Go make sure it's not on your network. But when you do so, please look historically. It's amazing. Once we talk about things publicly, threat actors change their IOCs. They change their indicators. So going and looking in today's live network traffic probably isn't going to buy you a whole bunch. But go look historically. Go back and see if you've seen those indicators. It's in the technical alert that I referenced at the beginning. Look to see if any matches hit there. But remain focused on the tactics. Think about the tactics that I've mentioned. Think about the concept of using link files. Think about the tactics of SMB. Think about all of these different pattern-based elements because there's a much higher success rate to find it in a behavior-like analysis to be able to go from here. Third bullet of the first section, don't whitelist network traffic. What do I mean here? How many of you have worked in some type of a SOC environment and you've gotten the phone call from your manager who got the phone call from his supervisor who got the phone call from the CEO that said, I didn't get a very important email, right? The CEO says an email came through and it got blocked by spam. And the order comes down, make sure it never happens again. So we go in and we whitelist that IP or that email address, blah, blah, blah. And then 2 weeks later, we get the call directly from the CEO that says it happened again. If it happens a third time, you're fired. So what do? This is 5-10 years ago. We go into our firewalls and we do things like allow all from that vendor star. And we have really good intentions that it's only going to last for a little while. And then we get busy and we never remove these allow all very wide gaping holes in our firewalls. And in numerous situations, we saw asset owners who had done something similar to this. They had opened massive holes for legitimate business purposes that were just simply too wide and lasted too long. And so when threat actors compromised a vendor network or some type of other trusted network, there were rules in the firewalls, rules in the IDS that said, oh, don't worry, we trust these guys. And so the threat actor walked right in. Good chance to have caught it there, and they missed it. Bottom two bullets on this slide, related mitigations. The most obvious if you haven't caught it already. Block outbound SMB. There is no good business justification for having SMB outbound. Okay? And it sounds really obvious. It's about number 1257 on the list of things that every cyber department should do. But many cyber departments haven't made it that far. So go block SMB outbound. And this whole thing goes away for what we know today. The whole thing goes away because everything depends upon SMB outbound for credential harvesting. You block them at that stage. Second thing, require multi-factor authentication. Everything we've seen is single factor. They got usernames and passwords and walked back in the door. If you don't have an externally exposed attack surface area that allows single factor, they're not going to be able to leverage it. So block that second factor. Now, what are we as DHS looking at? Where are we going with this campaign? Where does our analysis continue? First of all, we're trying to look into the multi-factor. We're trying to understand, are they attempting to get around that or find other methodologies by which they can overcome that particular choke point. Second thing, anytime there's any type of direct access or information of a control system, remembering we want the big picture. We're trying to protect the entire United States at the same time. We ask our asset owners and operators to let us know, even if it hasn't gotten very far down the kill chain, we're trying to collaborate that information so we can catch it much earlier in the process. And finally, learning about the non-interactive, the scripts. We didn't see a tremendous amount, there's a few, but didn't see a tremendous amount of use of automation in this attack. It's very, very hand-driven. And we know that to scale it has to. And so we're looking for that evaluation and that understanding and that effort. All of this comes back together because of our overall mission, which is to look at the big picture. And when I say that, we have a number of mechanisms in the United States that we use to do this. We have automated indicator sharing, which is a machine-to-machine communication about threats. We have different collaboration and information sharing mechanisms by which all of these elements come into play. This is my sales pitch for all of the countries and all of the organizations out there to be more open, to share more. We are going to win this war by sharing information and trusting each other appropriately and finding those mechanisms. And so take that effort to be able to do that, to be able to go through that experience and to make all of that happen. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for that excellent talk. Small gift of appreciation. Thank you. Are we ready for questions?
I'm sure. We'll pretend to be.
All right. So we'll just dive right through it. So, you mentioned two-factor authentication as a good thing, but why isn't it pushed by regulations?
The push by regulations. So there are a number of regulations inside the United States that do require multi-factor authentication in specific environments. There are much more of a situation, speaking again in the US, where exceptions can be made. So there may be a regulation in place. There may be situations where regulation's not there. But where a company says, I need more time, or here's the exception, this small window kind of area. And so there are numerous places where we have lowered the bar, we being the corporations, et cetera, lowered the bar for operational purposes. And I don't think that that lesson learned applies just to multi-factor authentication. Number of times we have, hopefully a company has good change control, documents all of their exceptions, But if you go look at the risk profile of the exceptions, I think we have some area to improve in that space.
Okay. If the attacker did not press any buttons, did they try to persist in the system for later? If so, how?
Sure. So if they didn't push the buttons, were they sticking around, right?
Yes.
Is the question. Hard question to answer. The question is really, what was the intent? Can I read their minds? Definitely, I think there would be implications should the button be pushed for all of us, not just for the victim, not just for the attacker. There's going to be implications when the button does get pushed. The question of why they didn't is much more subjective. Hopefully there was some back thought and some effort in that regard. We as defenders need to be prepared to identify both the immediate push, the microseconds, they get access and they push it. We also need to be prepared for situations where they get the access and they wait. They sit there for a month or a year or longer in that effort. So I can't say why they didn't push it, but I can definitely say we need to be prepared.
So have you seen any cases where you find an adversary inside the system and you try to clean it out and then discover later that they actually managed to get a foothold that you didn't discover?
Sure. So basic methodology of pen testing or of red teaming is the concept of covering your tracks, right? So absolutely there are going to be situations where they want to appear to have gone, but maintain persistence. Sure, definitely. On this particular campaign, I can't think of anything specific that would fall directly into that description, but numerous talking about campaigns as a whole, we definitely see covering of tracks, and we try and see, and we'll see subversion. We'll see ones where they try and lead you down the wrong path. You have to be cautious for that. You can't close out the incident and stop monitoring for the elements pertaining to it.
Right, okay. So is reliable attribution possible? Attribution?
Next question? No. Okay, is reliable attribution. So the question was asked of Mark Bristow, who is my direct lead, was asked the question of how do we know it's the Russians, right? He gave a great answer. I can't use the same one. So let me say it this way. The United States wouldn't make the accusation if we weren't confident in the answer. And I truly believe that not just on this case, but in many cases, and not just governmental accusations, that you can gather enough evidence to be able to be certain about these types of things. But I think it's less, for us that are at the network defender, the technical level, it is less about who to point the blame at, and it is more about understanding and collaborating the techniques and the procedures that they're using so we can defend against them later. So exactly what Joe was saying in that effort, we have to understand, we have to start looking broader at a techniques perspective. So attribution, for me, at a technical level, is so I know the other TTPs, the other IOCs to look at. It's not so much so I can put a name on the top of the paper, but I do believe it's possible, absolutely.
Okay. So was there a specific reason why the victims didn't block SMB going out?
Was there a specific reason? Yes. Most of them hadn't gotten to it. Some of them didn't know about it. And then there's the third one, and this happened on several, small handful number, where they had accepted the risk. And they had business justifications. They said, we need to move data outside our network, and we're doing it by SMB because this is the business process. And some CISO somewhere signed his name saying, oh, that's not a big deal. And I'll tell you what, I've had those conversations with the CISOs, and my answer is always, it should have been a lot bigger risk than you thought it was. Mm-hmm. I have not seen a situation where I think that the business benefit outweighed the risks, not even close.
No, I agree. But I mean, typically you would think that firewalls are default but deny, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that it should be blocked. So maybe they open it. Could it be for the same reason they whitelisted all the, or allow all for the email, for example?
It absolutely could.
So was someone just afraid of losing their job?
I saw I won't get too specific, can't tell you all the details. I saw an evaluation, we were on site, and we had a firewall we came across that had 30,000 rules.
Wow.
You can't audit 30,000 email or 30,000 rules because you can't figure out what it is. And so trying to go back and understand why that particular hole in the wall was opened was very impossible. And I find most organizations don't manage their documented exception rules, let alone their undocumented exception rules. And so there are a myriad of reasons on why it can occur, but I think that all falls into that category.
Yeah, okay. So what type of websites were used as watering holes?
The websites used as watering holes primarily, not quite exclusively, but primarily, were the vendors, the upstream, the outer rings of the circle. Those are the websites they were compromising. So you are going to the trusted vendor that you've gone to for 5 or 10 or 15 years to do your normal business. That's the one that has the iframe attached, or the case that may be, same thing with the spearfishing emails. They're coming from those trusted vendors in that relation. And one comment on that, in most circumstances, we saw legitimate traffic and we saw malicious traffic parallel to each other. Not exactly parallel, but same concept of you would have to, as a network defender, you would have to sort through. And you would have to understand, yes, this employee went out to that website to do legitimate business because, and we can't block it, or we need to put some kind of control in, where the malicious side was happening at the same time.
So did the bad guys have access to any other ICS system that you know of? That's the question.
Did the bad guy have access to any other ICS systems? So the right answer is they definitely had access to other ICS systems in the sense of there are victims that they got different levels of access to. So some of them they got to the jump boxes, and some of them they got to the HMIs, and some of them they got just to the ICS DMZ, et cetera. So there were numerous elements like that. In terms of the number of HMIs or actual process controls, that's a fairly small number. That's not in the hundreds kind of element at all.
Okay, how many organizations did the threat actors penetrate to HMI level?
That is not a number we have released. Repeating, small number, small handful.
Number? No more than 1,000?
Way less than 1,000.
So did they crack the NTML hash, or was there some kind of pass the hash possible on the perimeter?
Myriad of different attacks depending on the environment in that effort. We definitely saw manipulation of landman. Very old technique, right? Kind of concept. You have it out there, they grab it, they pull it. Kind of efforts, SMB weaknesses, and how it transmits, and some other things that come into play there. There's not one concise answer to the methodology they always used. They knew how to live off the land, right? They adapted to, when they tried something and it failed, okay, let's go back and do it a different method to be able to grab that hash or to crack it or to pass it accordingly.
Yeah, but was it possible at any point to actually use the pass the hash at the perimeter?
There would be situations where they definitely could have used pass the hash due to the configuration of the internal networks.
Right. So what was the initial trigger to identify the adversary, and how long did the adversary, how long was it present on the system?
Sure. The initial mechanism to detect. It is fun to work at the governmental level when you have hundreds of victims. The story never starts at day one. You never begin with patient 0. You always get your first trigger somewhere in the middle. And then you spider out and you start to build the story and you collect all the data and you start to understand. The initial detection for us, I don't actually know exactly. We had several things that came together. We saw this originally as about 4 or 5 different attacks. And as we gained information about both, they started to merge together and started to build a bigger picture. And we started to understand the commonalities in that effort. Ultimately, some of this was victim identified, victims who found it and called us. Other things were things that we were tracking and being able to see there in that effort. So it was a collaborative effort across a number of places.
So and how long, the longest period of time were they on the systems undetected?
So I would refer to, again, that initial victim who showed right-hand side of the bullseye, early 2016. Kind of effort, and you really saw the bulk of this coming to fruition and well aware in the summer of 2017. So based on that, I would probably say in that kind of time frame is a reasonable estimate.
Okay. Has the relationship between changes in the world politics and ICS security incidents been also reviewed by pattern and categories?
I'm going to read that one again. Okay, Eric. Relationship between change. So absolutely, and the answer is yes. We just stood up a National Risk Center that takes a little bit broader picture, so we're not quite as technically focused on IP addresses and hashes. We're looking at all elements of risk, and we're looking at, I shouldn't say all, many elements of risk, trying to evaluate, et cetera. I'm absolutely positive that political climate and things like that are being taken into consideration at that level. But that's a much more strategic view. When we talk about the tactical elements of a campaign in the cyber warfare range kind of things, that's going to be much more down at the what are the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, the IP addresses, et cetera. So there's influence there and there's communications and we're talking. Our watch floor has hundreds of people on it. We're trying to collaborate that data. But when it comes down to tactical information we're going to use, it's going to be a little more granular than that. So.
Yeah, okay. All right then. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the excellent talk.